Hello, everyone. It's Scott, and we're back with day 3 of Aetherdrift spoilers. So, we got a lot of interesting cards from the day. We've got a mythic rare that's an ooze, and we got several interesting vehicles for the day to talk about, and some more goblins that might just make goblins a deck that could actually be played in standard. But before we get to the individual previews, remember to like and subscribe to get further content like this throughout Aetherdrift spoiler season and beyond. All right, so our first card of the day is March of the World Ooze for 3 and 3 green mana. You get an enchantment, and creatures you control have base power and toughness of 6/6 and are oozes in addition to their other types. Whenever an opponent casts a spell, if it's not their turn, you create a 3/3 green elephant creature token. So basically, if they cast a spell on your turn, you get a 6/6 because the base power and toughness of all your creatures becomes 6/6. So I really like this card. I think this is definitely going to be playable in standard. And I think you play it in a ramp deck of some kind where you're using Lyanna War Elves and other green creatures that provide mana. And you just kind of ramp into this early in the game, and then all of your creatures are 6/6s as long as March of the World Ooze is on the battlefield. To me, this might be, of the mythic rares we've seen, potentially the most playable mythic rare that we've seen so far. And I think it gives some hope that green as a deck is actually something that could have a role to play in standard moving forward, specifically in Aetherdrift standard season. Next, we've got Mindspring Merfolk for a blue mana. You get a Merfolk Wizard. That's a 1/1. It has Exhaust, and you can pay X and 2 blue mana and draw X cards, and then put a +1/+1 counter on each Merfolk creature you control. So I really like this card. 1 mana, it's pretty basic, but that Exhaust ability to me is very valuable. We don't quite have the critical mass of Merfolk right now to have a good Merfolk deck, but there are a lot of solid Merfolk cards right now in standard, and I think this might be one of the cards that helps bring that deck to an even more playable state, and because of that, I think this might be our best rare of the day. Next, we've got Possession Engine for 3 and 2 blue mana. You get an artifact vehicle. That's a 5/5. And when this vehicle enters, gain control of target creature an opponent controls for as long as you control this vehicle. That creature cannot attack or block as long as you control this vehicle. So I'm looking at this in 2 ways. First, it's a really nice way in blue to take the best creature in essence your opponent has off the field. You gain control of it. You can use its abilities. You can use it to crew things or saddle things. So from that standpoint, I think there's a value there. But the big thing I see with this is you really are going to see that right now in standard, we really don't have very much artifact removal. Nobody's playing a braid. Nobody's playing any of the other artifact removal spells. So because of that, I think Possession Engine might be really well positioned in blue decks to be a way of removing simply the best thing your opponent has, and then you get to use it and its abilities as long as Possession Engine stays in play. So I think it's got some standard playability given where we are currently in standard. Next, we've got Fearless Swashbuckler for 1, a blue, and a red mana. You get a Fish Pirate with haste. That's a 3/3. And whenever you attack, if a pirate and a vehicle attack this combat, draw 3 cards and then discard 2 cards. So yesterday I talked about the Marauding Mako, and I think that card along with Fearless Swashbuckler were meant to be played together. And they're both pirates, and we already have a lot of solid pirates from the Lost Caverns of Ixalan, so we might even have a solid pirate deck moving forward in standard. But I think the thing that makes me most interested in this card is that your vehicles get haste. So you play the Marauding Mako on turn 1. You play an artifact that's a vehicle on turn 2. On turn 3, you play this. You attack with it, and then you use your 1-drop to go ahead and crew that vehicle. And now you've got that condition met, and then your Mako is going to get 2+1/+1 counters on it, and you're really off to the races with building that. So if your opponent doesn't have removal for that Mako before you get Fearless Swashbuckler down and you get that first attack in, it's going to grow very quickly if they can't do something about it fast, because turn after turn after turn, you're going to be able to attack with a vehicle, attack with a pirate, and continue to get counters on your marauding Mako. And to me, that combination of things I think is good enough to see play in standard. Now, is it a tier 1 deck? I don't think so, at least not in the development stage here, but it might have a chance, given what we're getting from Aetherdrift, that it has some standard playability. Next, we've got Curse Cloth Wrapping for 2 and 2 black mana. You get an artifact, and zombies you control get +1/+1, and you can tap it, and target creature card in your graveyard gains Embalm until end of turn. The Embalm cost is equal to its mana cost. So I think this is an interesting concept on this artifact, where you're using the ability from Amonkhet, that Embalm ability, and now all of your creatures have it because of this artifact. And I can see this being played in some of the black decks that we currently have as just a way of getting your stuff back. And under those circumstances, I think that makes it good enough to see some standard play. Next, we've got Boom Scholar for 1, a red and a green mana. You get a Goblin Advisor who's a 3/3, and it comes with some very important abilities. Exhaust abilities of other permanents you control cost 2 less to activate. So this is kind of a lord for exhaust creatures or things that have exhaust. And it also has its own exhaust ability for 4, a red and a green mana. Creatures and vehicles you control gain trample until end of turn, and you get to put 2 +1/+1 counters on this creature, making it a 5/5. So I think if we do see an exhaust deck form, this is a card definitely that people are going to want in it, because it's going to reduce that exhaust cost. And when we look at creatures like Grease Wrench Goblin for 1 mana, you get a 2/1 Goblin Artificer. Its exhaust costs 3, but if you've got Boom Scholar in play, now it's 1, and you discard 2 cards, then you draw that many up to 2 cards, and you get to draw that many cards, and you get to put a counter on Grease Wrench Goblin. So I think, under those kinds of circumstances, if we have a deck that's really built around the mechanic, then this is a great card in it. And Grease Wrench Goblin would be a great 1-drop in that style of deck, because if you get Boom Scholar down, then, well, the next turn you can immediately activate the exhaust ability of Grease Wrench Goblin and get those cards that you want and the +1/+1 counter on your Grease Wrench Goblin. Next, we've got Spot Cycle Scouter for 1 and a white mana. You get an artifact vehicle, that's a 3/2. And when this vehicle enters the battlefield, you get to scry 2, and its crew cost is 1. So this is one of those vehicles that I think has some playability in standard. And the reason for that is you get the scry ability on it. Now in limited, I think this is a card you definitely would want to play in your deck. Getting that scry 2 early in the game could be very important to your overall strategy in limited matches. But I think because it only costs 1 to crew it, it's not a bad card to consider to be played in a vehicle deck in standard. Next, we've got Wrench Remover for 4 mana. You get an artifact creature. That's a construct. That's a 3/4. And whenever this creature enters or attacks, exile up to 1 target card from a graveyard, and you gain 1 life. So this is a common, certainly a good card in limited. It does have cycling on it as well, and I do believe that the ability to exile cards from your opponent's graveyard is a strong ability. So again, probably not going to see much, if any, standard play, but in limited, a good card, and maybe it has some fringe playability in standard because you can exile target cards from a graveyard. Next, we've got Marshall's Path Cruiser for 3 mana, and it's an artifact vehicle. That's a 6/5. And when this vehicle enters the battlefield, search your library for a basic land, reveal it, put it in your hand, and then shuffle. So 3 mana, you get a vehicle, and you get a land. Not bad in terms of rate. It also has an exhaust ability. For 1 mana of each color, this vehicle becomes an artifact creature, and you get to put 2+1/+1 counters on it, and its crew cost is 5. So to me, this is probably not standard playable because of the crew cost, but in limited, the ability to go get a basic and then later in the game, use this as a pretty strong creature to either block or attack with, I think is fine in limited. Next, we have Cloudspire Captain for 2 and a white mana. You get a human pilot, that's a 2/3, and mounts and vehicles you control get +1/+1. This creature saddles, mounts, and crews vehicle as though its power were 2 greater. So it can saddle or crew anything up to 4 power. So most of the current vehicles and mounts in standard, Cloudspire Captain can mount or crew. And because of that, I think this is standard playable if we do see a mount or vehicle deck develop, because I really do like the ability of giving all your mounts and vehicles +1/+1. And you're probably going to be playing this in a deck where you're going to have a probably relatively even distribution of mounts and vehicles and creatures that can go ahead and crew or saddle those. So I think this has some standard playability because it gives that buff to the mounts and the vehicles. Next, we've got Momentum Breaker for 1 and a black mana. You get an enchantment with Start Your Engine. And when this enchantment enters the battlefield, each opponent sacrifices a creature or vehicle of their choice. Each opponent who can't discards a card. So that I like on this card. So if you're playing against somebody who doesn't have a deck that's playing a lot of creatures, well, you can just force them to discard a card if they don't have a vehicle or a creature they can sacrifice. And then you can pay 2 and sack this enchantment, and you gain life equal to your speed. So you could gain up to 4 life for that 2 mana. So I think this has fringe standard playability. Certainly in limited, I would want this in my pull because it can kill a vehicle or it can kill a creature, and I think it's a good removal card in limited. Next, we've got Defend the Rider for a green mana. You get an instant, and you get to choose 1. Target permanent you control gains hexproof and indestructible until end of turn, or you get to create a 1/1 colorless pilot creature token with this token saddles, mounts, and crews vehicles as though its power were 2 greater. So I think again this is a good card in limited, and potentially it has some standard playability because it does give hexproof and indestructible, which I think are things that do get overlooked sometimes in standard, is that indestructible ability. And maybe this goes in our Gruul Prowess deck with Leyline of Resonance as something that you can use to get not only give your permanent hexproof but also give it indestructible, because there will be times when your opponent is doing something that could result in your creature dying, like using a board wipe. Well, you use this, it can be protected from that board wipe unless it's exile removal. Next we've got Auchark Mammoth. It's 4 and 2 green mana to cast, and you get a creature that's an elephant mount and is a 5/5. And when this creature enters the battlefield and whenever it attacks while saddled, create a 3/3 green elephant creature token with saddle 5. So I think in standard it's going to be very difficult for this card to see any play, even though you're getting to create a 3/3 elephant creature token when you cast it and it hits the battlefield. The saddle cost of 5 is what really makes it difficult for this kind of card to see play in standard. Because of that, I think it's probably a limited card only. Next, we've got Mold Tender for a green mana. You get an Insect Druid. That's a 1/1. And you can tap it to mill a card, or you can tap it to exile a card from a graveyard, and you get to add 1 mana of any color. So kind of a weird set of abilities on Mold Tender. I like the ability that you can go ahead and mill stuff. So in our Delirium deck, this is a card that you might want to consider as a 1-drop in that. But what I really do like about this is that you can exile things from your graveyard to add mana to your mana pool. So it kind of fits 2 abilities, because currently in that Delirium deck, you don't have that ability. So, say you mill, a couple of lands, well, you can exile one of them to go ahead and add mana. And again, you can simply tap it to add more cards to your graveyard to get that Delirium ability quickly. Next, we've got Ether Siphon for 1 and 2 blue mana. You get an artifact with Start Your Engine, and you can pay 2 mana and draw a card. And when you reach max speed, whenever you draw a card, each opponent then mills 2 cards. So I think, I don't know if this is really standard playable at this point. I do like the ability to have a card in play that is a mana sink when you need it to be, where you can, tap it, draw a card. So great ability on it. I wish this was 2 mana and not 3 to cast, more like Mazemind Tome is. But I can see definitely in limited, this is a very strong card. And maybe there's a deck out there that wants to mill your opponent whenever you draw a card. And because of that, in that style of deck, then I think it does have some standard playability. Next, we got Intimidation Tactics for a black mana. You get a sorcery, and target opponent reveals their hand. You choose an artifact or creature card from it, and you exile that card, and you can cycle it for 3 mana. So this is, I think, a card that will see at least sideboard play in standard. And I think the determining factor is how much artifacts are going to matter in the upcoming standard seasons. If they do matter a lot, then I think this becomes a main deckable card, because most of the decks currently in standard are creature based. And because of that, Intimidation Tactic is going to hit something almost all the time when you would play it. Sometimes it actually does better than Duress does, even though you would think Duress would always hit something. I mean, I'm seeing games where Duress doesn't. So I think this does have some standard playability as a sideboard option. Next, we've got Unswerving Sloth for 3 and 2 white mana. You get a creature that's a sloth mount and is a 5/5. And whenever this creature attacks while saddled, it gains indestructible until end of turn. Untap all creatures you control, and its saddle cost is 4. So I really do like this card. And the reason I like it is we got a card yesterday that gave you in red, that was a rare, that gave you extra attack phases. So I really like Unswerving Sloth if you were able to get a deck built correctly where you're able to use that ability well, because this is not only going to untap the creatures that are attacking, but it's also going to untap anything that you use to saddle or crew something. So on that second time, your vehicle's already crewed, your mount is already saddled, so they'll get to attack again. And then now you're going to be able to attack with anything that crewed it or saddled a vehicle that was on your side on the previous attack step. So I like it. but it's going to be in kind of that kind of niche deck where you're trying to really take advantage of it because of the 5 mana cost for it to see standard play. Next, we've got Canyon Vaulter for 1 and a white mana. You get a core pilot, that's a 3/1. And whenever this creature saddles a mount or crews a vehicle during your main phase, that mount or vehicle gains flying until end of turn. Okay, this to me is a playable card in either a Selesnya mount deck, which I think is where the mount side of the card's going to go, and in any kind of vehicle deck. You know, kind of over the last couple of days, we've seen some good red and white vehicles. So if a deck forms around those, I could see Canyon Vaulter going in that, because the ability to give things that don't normally have flying is actually really powerful in standard, because that evasiveness that it's going to give to that creature is really something that can, in the end, win you games out of nowhere, because your opponent won't be able to block because they don't have any flying creatures. All right, next we've got Pedal to the Metal for X and a red mana. You get an instant, and target creature gets X plus 0 and gains first strike until end of turn. Limited playable card, nice cantrip in limited, but we won't see it in standard. And our final card of the day is Goblin Surveyor for 2 and a red mana. You get a creature that's a Goblin Scout. It's a 3/2 with Trample. It also has Start Your Engine. And when you reach max speed, you can pay 3 mana and exile this card from your graveyard to draw a card. So again, limited playable, but we probably won't see it anywhere beyond that. All right, those are the previews from day 3 of Aetherdrift preview season. Remember to like and subscribe to get further content like this throughout Aetherdrift spoiler season. And I've left links to some of the other video previews from day 1 and day 2 for you to take a look at. And I will see you in the next one. Thanks. I'll see you next time.